Good míle maith go bhas a bháil te chríúil sin. Thanks very much for that welcome. I'm going to start straight away. There used to be West Kerry story man who used to walk the back roads. His name was Seán O'Crihan. His father was Tomás O'Crihan. Tomás O'Crihan is famous for being a storyteller who eventually wrote himself out of a tradition where he would only remain in an oral tradition. He wrote a book. That book was an tSionnaigh, translated to English, The Island Man. Some of you may have read it or know of it. I've only been in Philadelphia for about 2 hours and I'm already going to give you homework. Anybody who hasn't read this yet should read one or the other or both. They're very interesting. There are some fantastic passages like the one where Tomás O'Crihan decides to attack a cow seal. He did that and he won the fight. He killed the cow seal, but she managed to take a bite out of his thigh before dying, and that left a big hole in his thigh. The island remedy for that wound was to, as the story goes, take some of the seal's meat and put it into his own leg, wrap it up. They claimed that worked. I don't really know how that would work, but I'm not a physician. Although I'm a doctor now, apparently, I'm not a physician, and I'm not an island man, even though Ireland is one of the biggest islands in the world. But you know, Ireland is not as good an island as the Great Blasket Island. And Tomás O'Crihan then was the first one of that island to write, and he wrote an tSionnaigh. His son was Seán O'Crihan. He wrote a book called Lá Dar Sail, which hasn't been translated, and maybe one of Ciara's students could translate Lá Dar Sail, or anybody else could translate Lá Dar Sail. I don't know if anybody knows what that means, but Lá Dar Sail is a phrase we use in Irish. The example I thought of, if in Philadelphia I have a Philly cheese steak and I'm hesitating about whether to wash it down with a cheesecake, a friend could say to me, "Era Lá Dar Sail," which kind of means like YOLO, in a way. Lá Dar Sail could be a translation for YOLO, you only live once. Literally a day of our lives. So Seán O'Crihan wrote Lá Dar Sail. Has anybody heard of Seán O'Crihan? Okay, one person has, 2 people have. Forget everything I just said about those guys, because they don't have anything more to do with this talk. The person I'm talking about, I think I need to be clear about, I'll be talking about Seán McCrihan, who lived from 1875 to 1955, and our discussion today about aspects of his culture will have to do with oral history, song, a tongue twister, and some of the politics around using folk material at the state level in education. So first I'll give you an idea as to where he was from, because it'll give you some idea as to the authenticity of his repertoire. In fact, McCrihan was born and spent all of his life beside a 6th century church that Kerry Hardy in her poem described as the ruined church with the roof built out of stone. Here you can see exactly where that is, in West Kerry, within West Kerry. That's a cycle route I do often, from the church to the harbour where you can get a boat across to the great abandoned Blasket Island. And that's where those places are in the context of Ireland, and I won't go to Europe. Local B&B in Kerry provides this map, so you can see where it is. So this guy I'm talking about, his name was Seán Mac, as opposed to Seán O'Crihan. And there's a slight difference there, as some of you probably know. Irish surnames have Mac, or Nick, or O, or Ni in them. Some of them meaning son or grandson, others meaning daughter, granddaughter. And this Seán McCrihan I'm talking about is not that famous at all yet, or not famous at all. And I'm hoping to make him famous. I did the thesis on him. I have a book coming out this year on him. I want him to be known about because he's a very important man. Another thing I have in common with Seán McCrihan, I haven't studied him, is the fact that we both use an English form of our name and an Irish form of our name. So Seán McIntonig is my name. Seán McCrihan was his name. He also used an English form. Shane Fox, Seán McIntonig, he was Seán McCrihan. Seanach in Irish is fox. Crihin is also actually an old word for fox. That's funny. We're basically John Fox, both of us. So John Fox by John Fox, basically, being published this year. Sean McCrahin doesn't appear under his Gaelic name in the colonial census because there was a prejudice against Irish. So he appears here as John Croghan. That was his father, actually, John Croghan, and there he is. Again, another John Croghan. Speaks Irish and English. We can see here as well his gravesite. So the colonial regime didn't recognize his Gaelic name in the census. Years later, into the Irish Republic, the local gravestone maker didn't either recognize the Gaelic. He used the English. This talk isn't supposed to be about colonial hangovers, of which there are many, but there are some things I just want to mention right now to get them out of the way. Last October when I handed my thesis in, in absentia. I was in Notre Dame. And my thesis, I had it printed in Limerick, and I had a courier deliver it within Limerick. And the first time I got there, the print was all wrong. There was accents missing, just wrong Irish on the cover. I was angry about that, and they said, okay, we'll fix it for free. And then they fixed it for free, but they didn't fix it. It was free, but it wasn't a fix, and then I had to have it taken out of the library again and then resubmitted. So I finally got there to receive my diploma and looked at it, and it was okay. But that was a headache. I was in Indiana having to think about these attitudes to the Irish language in my country. It wasn't fun. So I won't say any more about that. If you want, at the end, you can ask me a question about it, what you think about that. I don't know what direction you want this talk to take. I try to live my life through Irish as much as possible, and normally I insist on being called Sean Mac, but recently I had to insist on being called Shane Fox. Why? Because, Villanova were so nice. They flew me here. And I forgot to remind them that on my passport, I'm Shane Fox. So they just went ahead and got the ticket for Sean Mac. And at first, Delta didn't want to change the name. And I was really embarrassed about that. But I kept calling them. And the fourth telephone representative decided to change it. But the official policy with Delta is if you have a wrong name, you buy a new ticket. So persistence, just be persistent. Back to Sean McCrahin. Enough about me. One thing to do, mentioning the ticket, mentioning Villanova. Thank you very much, Villanova. Thank you all for coming. I'm very happy to be here. This is great. Now back to Sean McCrahin. Unlike the literary Crahins of the Great Blasket Island, Sean McCrahin was illiterate, never learned to write. This made him all the more interesting to me. You would think that as a teacher and a reader and a writer that I'd not be impressed by illiteracy. A phrase from Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, though, will explain why I was impressed by illiteracy in this case. Sean McCrahin was unfettered by letters. That's a great phrase. Unfettered by letters. He was an Irish Shanachie. He was illiterate. That means that his storytelling repertoire had been transmitted for hundreds of generations by word of mouth. And that's fascinating to me. The kind of Irish he spoke then was free from the influence of what is pejoratively referred to as Gaelan and Lower book Irish. There's this sort of respect for the spoken language and a contempt for the written language. So Gaelan and Lower means book Irish, and it's not. If somebody tells you Gaelan and Lower ha gutso wuchel, that's not a good thing to hear. That's not like a speech. In English, if someone tells you, "Wow, you speak like Shakespeare," that's a good thing in English. So that's an interesting comparison, I think. So Sean McCrahin didn't speak Gaelan and Lower, and his expressions, vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation are all part of a very long tradition. He has an oral account of how the Vikings liked Ireland that had been passed from the time of the Vikings, 10th century to the 20th century. He said Vikings couldn't stand the Irish winter. And you would think, the Vikings come from Scandinavia, further north than Ireland, but they were just known for not being able to withstand Kerry winters. I barely did the times I was there. So anecdotal history of this kind made it very interesting to do the research that I did. But my real interest in Sean McCrahin was to do with the language itself. because I'd been fascinated with that dialect, West Kerry Irish, since being there as a teenager. Someone said to me that Kerry Irish was like French, very simplistic, but it stuck with me. That's what made me interested in Kerry Irish. And French eventually I would learn as well. I went to Montreal to learn it, and I spent 2 years there. I came home from Montreal after 2 years, and that's a whole other linguistic situation. We could talk about that too. But came back from Montreal to Coláiste de Mhuireann and Small, which is 200 kilometers from the area that I was studying, the closest university to the dialect I was studying. And the Dingle Peninsula has a stunning, rugged landscape, as you can see there, which means that tourists love it. But the fact that there are so many tourists means that it can be hard for students to get accommodation. My response to that was to buy a caravan and put solar panels on it and get a mobile broadband stick and live there like that. Rain catchment device, plenty of rain. As you can see, there aren't many houses here. So this is where I lived, and this is the kind of view that I had when writing my thesis. So it was inspiring, to say the least. And yeah, here's me in the local library. The local library was better equipped with books to do with my subject than the university library was, because obviously it was the town library associated with the place I was studying. And I had around me a network of Irish speakers who were just in love with their linguistic heritage, folklore and the language, and they were very supportive of me. Me and one of them, we got on TV together. He's a local farmer, fantastic speaker of Irish, and this program was called Turas Bóthar. There are some scenes to be seen on YouTube. Very poetic speaker. In this scene, which might work if I play it, he's actually slagging me off for pushing pens for a living. He says, Mola gasihe och nakishe chokafeir shigging orta wochalin. How many days, how many nights has it been since you saw a bale of hay in a field, little boy? Yeah, so you know who this is. Speech of West Kerry is quite poetic. Poet Ciara has given me another platform to share information about this dialect, which I'm so interested in. Excellently entitled What the Focal. The blue and yellow and the crown represents the imagery of Munster, the Munster dialect. So West Kerry Irish is a dialect a sub-dialect of Munster Irish. I'm not a native of West Kerry, as you might have already guessed. And it was important for my research to acknowledge that I am an outsider coming in to study the dialect, and have to acknowledge that. I'm from Kilkenny in the southeast, the other side of the country. Yes, yes. So Kerry Hardy's poem, I don't know if any of you know Kerry Hardy. I just know her through this poem. Excellent. I just know her via the poem. She also talks about foreigners in waterproofs in primary colours. You see a lot of those around, because the majority of people come to Dingle to eat ice cream and see the token dolphin. It's one dolphin. And he comes back to see the tourists. So, people have been coming to this area for a long time, from the 19th century, with interests like mine. I'm not the first either, at all. And Sean O'Riordan, another poet, wrote a nice poem kind of expressing the collective experience of all these crazy people who go to brave the Kerry winter just to hear Irish being spoken. He wrote a good poem about that. I'm going to read the poem in Irish, and I'm going to have sort of subtitles on the screen in English. The subtitles aren't mine, they're from my friend Barry McRae, who translated it. This poem, Phil Rish, was nominated as Poem for Ireland in 2014. It didn't win, but it doesn't matter. It was nominated. And here's the poem. Phil Rish, Fog glawn in alt here, is a wildísh, seo har díarna idil. Dún tíntin harle, o bólach ca hiún táile. Is on uair go bhfuil an tólach traum san bó her fada, buindid bheir, srahar hivíaltocht an bhíorle, Shelley, Keats is Shakespeare. Phil Rish ar the chud, nig díntin, is nig de hanga, a chuig cangalte go réirh, a bhí bonus ciún le éirim, den Thichten is din Seaghan at Ginún Henig. Is let Higshe, Hain, not Tregiad, ni dul the nach a hig na have a regent. Terfuer na fallisir tron hona grain go corcogaine. Is kier hier ag bun na spare ag rahioch down, on iver ye, san mofa hitoch, san tishil garmach veil of dine. Sinead o Horace, Don Cheen fe Hullis and Tron Hona, Boile Soscolofer, Teentin Hain is the chlo cart. Nice poem, isn't it? I think you're supposed to drink water after saying poems. So over, I don't know, it's written in the 50s, that poem. Sean McCrahen lived until 1955, so it's safe to say that that kind of poem was written about people like Sean McCrahen, ideal speakers like Sean McCrahen. Yeah, it's kind of a paradox in a way that these ideal speakers who lived in an oral culture, all we know about them basically is in paper, in written script, in manuscripts, and it's a paradox and it's kind of sad. But over 1,000 of these manuscripts, these items exist from Sean McCrahen alone. 1,000 stories or recipes or dirty jokes or poems or genealogies. You know, each item is a thing, a different genre of oral tradition. There are recordings. That's another manuscript, but there are recordings that were made with the Ediphone. Now the Ediphone, most of the manuscripts that we have, they actually were transcribed from an Ediphone at the time, but they were used to create wax vinyls, which melted when the hot Irish summer came. And you know, of the hundreds of wax records that existed of Sean McCrahen, they all melted and they're gone. We're only left with 11 recordings made by Kevin Danaher of the Irish Folklore Commission. Good. So this is no, I won't say who it is. One of these people is a farmer. Another person is a civil servant folklorist. And what I love about this photo is that you can't tell which is which. Storyteller, farmer, civil servant, folklorist. I sat in the same place interviewing his granddaughter. And that's why this photo means a lot to me. So yeah, he would sit there and transcribe Sean's words. Joseph O'Dala is his name. He would sit there and transcribe Sean's words. Sometimes we'd have the Ediphone. So the Ediphone. Here is just an example of the new improved Ediphone. It's hard to understand, but I've given you a transcript, which is in Irish. For those of you who don't speak Irish, just listen to this ancient voice. Follow the words with your eyes on paper. Okay? Maybe a bit of context might help first. The story is a story about Daniel O'Connell, the liberator, the emancipator, Daniel O'Connell, from Kerry, native speaker of Irish himself, but he was totally against the Irish language. He wanted Ireland to be a modern Catholic nation, and he gave his speeches. He's very famous for creating outdoor rallies in the 19th century to rally the Irish people to look for home rule, at least from the British Empire. And all those speeches that he gave were in English. And he's famous for saying that he would witness without a sigh the gradual disuse of the Irish language, which makes me sad that he would say that. But in the stories in Irish, when they tell stories about him in Irish, they often portray him as a clever lawyer who comes to the poor man's aid. They're all the stories that mention him are praises of him, Daniel O'Connell. So this story is about Daniel O'Connell, what he does. So a poor farmer comes with 2 cows to a butcher. The butcher asks a question. It's a play on words. He tricks the farmer. He basically says how much for one bull, but he says it in such a way that could be understood as how much for both bulls. And what happens then is the farmer's only paid for 1 bull. But Daniel O'Connell comes and saves the day. So don't feel sorry for the farmer anymore. And let's listen to the story right now. Okay, maybe that's enough. So it goes on for longer. I didn't want to give anybody who's learning Irish an inferiority complex. That's very hard to understand. I think modern speakers of the same dialect would find that hard to understand, and it's a very bad recording as well. It's fantastic to have the recording, but it's not a good recording. So yeah, some of the work I did involved IPA, not beer. But here is a beer that's indigenous to the Dingle Peninsula in West Kerry. It's an IPA, tastes like hops, delicious. Yeah, so like IPA, Indian Pale Ale, probably the first thing that comes into your mind when you hear IPA. This is Dingle IPA. But the first thing that comes into my mind is the International Phonetic Alphabet, IPA. So here is another kind of Dingle IPA. This is an alphabet that's designed to represent sounds no matter what language it is, and it's supposed to be neutral. So this says, you know, it's a passage from the story. This would be agus da bhí an farbocht, logóireacht, ach do chuig an scéala go dtí Donal O'Connell, do bhí Donal an Marshall, gur bhfuil an farbocht leis, agus díortha sé dó, conas mar a bhí, ní sé ró, bhí Donal an Marshall. And that's how. So that takes a lot of time actually to do. You know, I'm not fluent in writing that language. I have to check the sounds. There's a database to do so. That took ages. That story is 2 minutes long. Probably spent an hour writing it like this, maybe more. And that was after I had written it out in Standard Irish. So I just did one story like that as part of my thesis. So Sean's speech was, that recording first of all was made in 1948. Sean is audibly at the end of his life. He speaks like somebody from the beginning of the 19th century. It's amazing to hear a voice like that in the 20th century, not so long ago. Many factors have contributed to the existence of this kind of language vacuum. One of them has to do with the fact that Sean's father, when Sean was born, Sean's father was 50. That's a remarkable age, just after the Irish famine. And actually, Sean's mother died soon after birth. And soon after that, all his brothers and sisters died too. So he was a child in a home with a man born in 1819. And I thought it was amazing. I was able to meet Sean's granddaughter, which meant when I interviewed her as part of my work, I was sitting beside a person who was two generations removed from a person who had been an adult during the famine. Yeah, that's quite a connection. That's amazing. So an important part of Sean's repertoire had to do with mediating the West Kerry experience of the famine. And so there's a lot of talk of that. And when I speak of mediating, what I mean is that he's an artist and he doesn't just relay the events. There's one very distressing story, so prepare for the distressing story. It's about a man putting up fences on a hill, one of the hills surrounding that church I showed you. And the man hadn't eaten for 2 days, and he was being forced by his landlord to do this work, putting up fences. I was forced to do the same work, actually, while I was there. I had to prove that I was a real man and do actual farm work. So it's very hard work to do, even with a full stomach. And he had done it for 2 days on an empty stomach. And on the third day, he woke up, and he had to go and do another day on the hill, and he still hadn't eaten. And he said to his wife, "Have the child dead before me this evening so I can have something to eat." And he went to work. And that story may not be true. We can't tell. But if you're able to read the rest of the manuscript, if you're able to go past that, you see that Sean uses a kind of deus ex machina, God steps in sort of literary technique. Because what happens in the rest of the story is that a rich stranger on a walk, probably learning Irish in the Gaeltacht, passes by the house and hears her crying. And he comes in and says, "What's wrong? What can I do?" She explained. He pulled out of his pocket a loaf of bread that got bigger and bigger according to you eating it. He came home that night and he had the bread, and that's the end of the story. So stories like that, he's created, when he brings in that literary device, deus ex machina, he's creating a fictional distance between the people and its own history, because maybe it's too much to process in one sitting, in a way. Scholarship around the famine, I don't really want to pronounce myself too much on it, but I think there's a lot of revisionism involved, and it's the case with all Irish history, revisionism and apologetic sort of revisionism. Aspects of Irish history need to be balanced a bit more by taking these kinds of accounts into consideration. The experiences of the people that actually experienced these things, not academics. Roberto Cahasig, he talks about how these stories they're not objective. Of course they're not objective. They're creative responses to the community's experience. But you need to take all kinds of responses into account. Academic response, creative response, physical response in archaeology. It's all valid. It's all maybe equally valid. So, should be okay. So Roberto Cahasig, I mentioned just there. I don't know if you've heard of Roberto Cahasig. He's a hero of mine, Robert. He's worked with so many different West Kerry storytellers and artists, and his book his past two books are the two most recent publications in West Kerry folklore, and this one is just out this month. I don't think it's been launched yet, but I have access to the cover. Not Trascroch den Egent and Blockson, Robert's latest book. There's a story. The song is important as well. Robard worked on Títlaid Lero, which is a collection of West Kerry song. Sean McCrahen was a singer, and actually his father was a singer too and a poet. Together they were known as Fili Nikile, which means the poets of the churchyard poets, we'll say. So we can leave the hard stuff behind. Oh no, we can't. There's another sad thing to talk about. So there's a song called "Is Fada me Búribh," which means I'm a long time worrying. Is Fada me Búribh, and Sean gave the words for this song, but he kind of prefaced the song with what we call personal narrative in folklore. So what he says, I'll read out what he says in my own translation. He says, "My father was singing Is Fada me Búribh to himself in the house one day. He was just passing the time so as he wouldn't be thinking of all the death he'd experienced. Then a visitor came to the door, and when the song was over, the visitor said that he'd have liked to have been in time for the beginning of the song. 'Well, if you're not in a hurry,' said my father, 'sit down in the chair there, and I'll start it up again.' The poor man sat down in the chair, and my father passed him the pipe. 'Have a go off that,' said my father, 'and I singing for you.'" So you can see here, this tells us about the role of song in 19th century Ireland. He was using it for personal solace, and reminded me of a French citation from Charles Baudelaire. It's very funny if you know French. It's kind of hard to translate into English. "J'ai crié dans la nuit que la vie est méchante, et l'écho m'a répondu chante." Very clever. The best I could do to translate was, "I cried out at night that life wasn't worth a thing, and the echo responded, sing." Basically what it's about. So, singing provides solace. Baudelaire was a contemporary of Sean's father, the one who had experienced all the death. So Sean didn't speak French. He was never in school. And the colonial education system that had existed since 1831 hated all languages except English anyway. So Sean wasn't in school, but he managed to learn English anyway. And unlike his father, who was a monoglot Irish speaker, Sean spoke English and he used it. He used it and it was part of his folklore. Unfortunately, the Irish state was very anti-English language, in the folklore department anyway, in the 20th century. And that means that whatever sort of stories, poems, only in English Sean had were not recorded. So it would have been interesting to see the kind of stories that he received to English, but we don't know. There are some macaronic songs. So macaronic songs, that means bilingual songs. I used to say to students, macaronic has nothing to do with pasta, nothing to do with mac and cheese, but it actually does. Liam Macamahuna has a citation there. The term derives indirectly from the Italian word macaroni, an earlier form of macaroni, denoting a wheaten past in tubular form. So yeah, macaronic song is like a mix of languages, bilingual. You could do a verse of I'm a Jolly Young Fellow. So Sean McCrahen sang a song called I'm a Jolly Young Fellow, and it was macaronic, meaning it had Irish and English. I will sing a bit, but I just have to drink water first. So. This is another song I sing with Seamus. Yeah. So at least when Seamus is there, I can have a break. There are lots of verses. Don't know how many I'll do. When it goes... Pass the pipe around first? The pipe is interesting as well, so... Because I'm taking American Native History at Notre Dame, and they use the pipe around death and funeral rites. Same thing, in Ireland, the tobacco is related to funerals. The reason being is that the wake, and you have snuff. The reason for that is that, in Irish tradition, we say that after Christ was buried, a tobacco plant started growing up out of the clay. So that's the folkloric meaning given to it, whatever importance you want to attach to that. So I'm a Jolly Young Fellow goes, I'm a jolly young fella, and out of me land and mains. Shan van valena tuarach dum banna spray. I placed my affections on one that had gold in store. So yellowest and energal and hindi hen gado. We made up our minds with each other for to elope. Gedorhin chapel gwne ma vile store. I met my true lover about the painted place. She a tarak chashel sodder bianale. 'Twas then I casted the juvenile jovial dem. Mielet grountes mo chapel of Eerdalane. We been in a hurry, I asked her to mount the mare. She had orche fan soccer, Tom Corhe Gunnol Bren. So I'll leave it there. I'm a Jolly Young Fellow. It's a macaronic song, and it's evidence for English in Sean McCrahen's repertoire. And there were, there was English verses, and there were English words as well. Like he'd speak Irish, and he'd throw in English words. He'd speak Irish, and he'd throw in Irish words based on English, and you can see just a selection of them there. Free allha, meaning free. Delicalha, meaning delicate. Some of them are more sinister, like pills, cryol, publican. People who spoke English used to visit him all the time. There was a Protestant schoolmaster called Máiste Footcroft. And Máiste Footcroft was described as not being such a bad fella for an Englishman. And the Irish for Englishman is Sassenach. Sometimes in the folklore you can't tell whether Sassenach means Protestant or Englishman. But anyway, Footcroft was well liked, I think. That was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek sentence. And anytime Footcroft is mentioned, it's said, Níor bhean roghine erhone vehna hasnach. So every time, I think it's a joke, I think it's just a funny thing to say. Footcroft had been all over Ireland as a teacher. And he didn't speak Irish, never learned it, but he was a philologist, so he's interested in words. And he mentioned a word for a magpie that Sean McCrahen didn't know, and I've yet been able to figure it out. So I obviously took to Twitter. Yeah. And the word is marea fota. That's how it was transcribed in the text. Nobody's ever heard of it. There are other words in my thesis as well, because I have a dictionary, I have a glossary in my thesis where there are strange words never printed before actually, and I try to explain what they mean. And that's at the end of my thesis there. So yeah, a lot of these words didn't make it. The English words definitely didn't make it into the state dictionaries. State dictionaries were needed to teach the language, and the English words didn't make it. Some other people were unhappy about that, like some of the poets. Michael Davitt was unhappy about that, I think. They would have preferred to describe the language as it is, but not pretend it's something else. One poem that Michael Davitt wrote. So Michael Davitt was from Cork City, and he also visited the Gaeltachts. And here's another poem about Gaeltacht experience. Vis all machri beat a gairan moor, alien muinoch o graumadach. It means it's a complete, unabashed Anglicism. Misal is miss, and beat is beat. Cree is heart. So my heart missed a beat. Vis all machri beat. And he was, of course, a beat poet as well. Vis all machri beat a gairan moor, alien muinoch o graumadach. So certain ways we have to undo some of the work done by the state. Poetry, one way. Glossaries at the back of unread thesis is another way. So yeah, how are we doing for time? We want to have questions as well, you see. Yeah. What would you say? Calculor? So I'm saying that the English influence is an important part, and we need to describe the language as it is. I'm all for describing the language as it is. Another thing I can mention, because there are some language students here, there are about 13 ways to make a word plural in Irish. English, you just add an S, Some of them are irregular, man, men, but that's about it. In Irish, there are about 13 ways. In West Kerry, there's an extra way. Because West Kerry, they have adopted the English S. So for some words, the Irish word for scholar, well, it really means student. The word for the kind of person that comes at 10 years of age to speak Irish for 3 weeks is a scláire. They're called scláris. So scláire, the proper plural should be sclári. In the dictionary, it would tell you sclári, and then scláris with the English S in West Kerry. Many other things. So I could talk about that for a long time. It's interesting. Even though when I speak Irish personally, I avoid all these things, actually. I try to be like a uber Celt. I try to use all Celtic roots. Which you shouldn't fear. So, but I respect everything. So, yeah. Aside from the debate of the English influence, the kind of Irish spoken by Sean. Obviously, it's West Kerry Irish. Probably the person most associated with West Kerry Irish and with Irish in general is Peg. Peg Sayers. There's Peg there. Peg with Brendan Behan. So Peg's supremacy in Irish. So Supreme Peg. Everyone knows Peg. And there was a tweet from tSionnaigh. I will not get in an argument with Peg today. I will not get in an argument with Peg today. I will not get in an argument with Peg today. Peg is probably the most famous of the Irish storytellers. It's very problematic. The fact that she's a woman obscures the fact that they collected hardly any, well, a very low percentage of the stories material collected were from women. And then you have Peg, who is a woman, who is the most famous. So that's problematic. Sean's wife, Máire Rummel, Máiread Rummel, was a storyteller, and she contributed a lot to the Irish Folklore Commission. She's recorded her name, so we saw the problem of the name, Shane Fox, Sean McIntonig, John Crohan, Sean McCrahan, and her name in the catalogue, Sean Crahan's wife. That's how she appears, so it's hard to find her. And you can hear her, some of the other recordings that are there, you hear her interrupt with corrections, grammar, and details of the story. You can hear her, and that's really cool. You can also hear the grandfather clock ticking. You can hear chickens. You can hear the radio. They weren't as aware of how to record stuff back then. They didn't think of turning off the radio. So yeah, they're really nice to listen to. Peg was used in school. Máire, what's her name again? Marnie Céalachair, isn't it? Marnie Céalachair edited Peg's material. I've edited Sean McCrahan's material. Máire Céalachair's edition was used in school to teach Irish, and it's fantastic Irish, but since it was a patriarchal society, Peg suffered a lot of death too. losing neighbours and family to drowning and immigration. And for that reason, people regard her quintessential book as misery literature. And that's a bad association for the language. It's damaged the language a lot. And people use Peg as evidence for needing to get rid of this Gaelic past, because all it brought us was misery. And that's problematic too. And that's obviously wrong. That's something we have to contend with today. Ciara is doing a very good job of it. And yeah, many more of our friends, I think we can say. So Pádraig Ó Ciabháin actually does a good job of it too. You wouldn't see him on Twitter too much, but he's a fantastic, prolific writer from West Kerry, Pádraig Ó Ciabháin. And one of his most recent works is the Ciún Focal, and he tackles the naysayers, the haters, head on with rhetoric and with irony. This is an ironic passage where he kind of slags off the people of Tralee. Now, there isn't too much Irish in Tralee, and apparently Pádraig thinks that people in Tralee have a poor view of the Irish language. This is Sat leis a glas a dúigiad an tangin dá labhart agus na hiarthig is atilis na túscirtig. Fight do they want to speak that whole language for? A méilh. Ábhar gael and facht scoilico, sean of lasirhi dá réir sin. So why do they want to speak this language? And he says they had learned some Irish in school and hated for that reason. So that, in literature, we're tackling these language issues, these language attitudes. So what else do we have? I have a Dublin bus Fogra notice. The reason I'm showing you this is because Sean had tongue twisters, and he had songs, and he had material from the Famine, and he had something in common with the state translators, which was a love for the subjunctive in Irish. Irish, like French, has a subjunctive. It isn't too spoken anymore, but it was in his time. This is a recent sign. This is a recent notice. You can't see it that well, but we have an example there. Fan Gustada and bus. Anybody who was flown with Aer Lingus, you would have been told at the end of the flight, "Good day, Shiv Slán." That's an example of the Irish subjunctive. Yeah, and Sean had plenty of examples too. The Irish subjunctive mood. He says, "Nuair roig maher o bhaile, good day, dalig droin the chush." When my father goes home, let him have a thorn bush grow out of his foot. Another one, go gura dia ar a las, ante a rit ma laurin rua. Let God settle the person who stole my red mare. So let God in English. Let a hawthorn bush grow. Subjunctive is like let. Subjunctive exists in languages to express wishes or doubt. Yeah, I seem to have lost a slide. So I mentioned subjunctive case, mentioned the famine, I mentioned song, mentioned grammar in general. I also had a tongue twister, which is very useful for schools. Kids love tongue twisters. Any of you studying education realize the value of tongue twisters. We call them rowloga in Irish. And Sean had many of them. One of them is a tongue twister, could equally be hip hop. It goes like this. Hóis ma fic is ma fotas ma fisa is le pic le puta le piece of an varigig. Bavo ma fic is ma fotas ma fisa not pic agus puta agus piece of an varigig. Repeat. Lots of interesting things, and I'm going to finish up after that little prologue with another subjunctive phrase, which many of you know. It's Gurav Mahagrev. Thank you for having your listening hats on today.
Do you have any questions for Sean from the audience?
Yeah.
Yes, Matt.
Have you found that there's much of a remainder of the folklore of the Great Blasket Islands in West Kerry, or has that died out?
A lot of what I was reading from Sean McCrichen, people know of today. For example, I would visit people in West Kerry and drink tea and sit beside the fire and talk to them. And they would ask me questions about what I had read, and they would pinpoint specific stories. Did you know this? Have you come across this? Sometimes I'd know it from reading Sean McCrahen. Other times I wouldn't yet have heard it. And then a few weeks later I'd read it and remember the person that had mentioned it to me. Padraig O'Sullivan Ballero, the man who was in Torres Boher with me, the road trip show on TG Cahir. He mentioned the story to me of the last man to be hanged in Ireland. And Sean McCrahen has a version of that same tale. So they would have both come across the same history through the oral tradition. And in all the songs as well, all the songs. Sean McCrahen was inland. It was 20 kilometres from the Blasket Islands, 20 kilometres from where you would take a boat to the Blasket Islands. So he had maybe less fishing lore. You know, the Blasket Islands was all about fishing and boats. They had an amazing life. They would see boats like the Titanic just go by the island, and if they had time, and if they had lobsters, they would row up to the big boat and try and sell lobsters. And they're probably getting lobsters for nothing in those big boats. Yeah. So Sean McCrahen was a dairy farmer. He didn't share that material.
Where did he live? In Dunquin?
Kilmalcader, beside the church, and his granddaughter who I interviewed lives in the house where he lived. Reese?
Stefan,
Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's wonderful to talk about somebody I don't know at all anything about, and I'm curious about the role of the translator in this, the Robin Flower, and we take people like Maurice Sullivan, who translates his own work, are you thinking about translating this in English? Is there an issue with that? Newland O'Connell, also from down in Kerry, famously does not translate her own work.
Moira Vakati.
Yeah, and so how are you thinking about translation in all of this?
So you mentioned the Island Man. I don't like that translation. It's too flowery. Like Robin Flower translated, but it's too flowery. It's good English. And I'm not saying Hiberno English isn't good English either, but I think it should be translated into Hiberno English. And when I read out that passage from Sean McCrahen, I imagined my own relatives from South Kilkenny speaking. I was translating into Hiberno English. I have some of what I mentioned this evening is from an article that's coming out in the next few weeks. It's going to be published in Estudios Irlandeses, not in Spanish, in English. And I had to translate some of those pieces to English. So I had been thinking about it. And yeah, it wasn't too difficult. I just imagined my relatives speaking English and tried to mimic them a bit. Yeah.
Could you tell us one story in English for the amateurs here? One of the stories from your...
Yeah, I could definitely tell a story.
Could you tell us what Daniel O'Connell did about the butcher?
He didn't. It isn't actually that witty.
Okay.
The butcher was witty in that story. He just comes along and uses emotional blackmail to have him pay for the second bull. The last sentence is the yield. He paid up. I don't know where it's gone. The last sentence is the Volchilischen Tlot. He actually hit him with a stick. The Volchilischen Tlotin Sichaune. He hit him with a stick. So yeah, there are bits that aren't clear, but he hit him with a stick and said, "Pay the man." That's the end of that story. Another story I like to tell, and maybe I'm not telling it that well because people don't seem to find it as funny as I found it. It's a story about clownness, which is arranged marriage, and it's just about a boy looking for advice from his father how to go about this meeting he has with his prospective in-laws. And he gets to the house and everything's going fine. He's dressed well, but when he takes off his shoes, he realizes that there's a hole in one of his socks, and he's really embarrassed about that. It shouldn't have bothered him because within seconds he was sitting at the dinner table, so they wouldn't have known. And he's making good small talk, and he's passing the butter and everything, keeping his elbows off the table. And for some reason he can't stop thinking about the hole in his sock. And he just bursts out eventually. He says, I can't take it anymore. Why aren't you mentioning the hole in my sock? And the father said, I noticed it earlier, and I was thinking that if you have a hole in your sock, they must not be your socks, because you needed to put a hole in them so they'd fit you. And that's the end of the story. Yeah, that was the shortest one I could think of. Remember, yeah.
Any other questions?
Did you hear the story about how the Irish language saved Daniel O'Connell?
I did, yeah. Do you want to tell it? I mean, there's one thing I love about this story, and it's extraneous to the story itself. Tomás, very accomplished speaker of Ulster Irish. The story he mentions is one where Daniel O'Connell is in London, and he's at a noble household, and he's been offered dinner, but they plan to poison him because he's busy in Ireland organising these rallies, making Catholics brave, and they happen to have an Irish maid working in the house, and she speaks Irish, and she knows Daniel O'Connell speaks Irish, and she knows that they're trying to poison him. So she comes in, she says, Ronald O'Connell an diggin to Gaelin. And he said, Tigim a Chalín cén rud is léir dit. So she says, Daniel O'Connell, do you speak Irish? And he said, I do, young girl, what have you noticed? And she's able to surreptitiously alert him to the poison. Yeah. So what I love about that story is that it's told in English across the country, Mayo, Cork, Kerry, and they say that part in Irish, regardless of whether the speaker knows Irish. And I think that's fantastic. Yeah. Possibly not, because a lot of these stories about smart guys, you know, Jonathan Swift appears too, and he's a smart guy, and he does all these witty, brilliant things. A lot of them are very old pagan stories, and they just plant a historical figure on the clever story. So it's possibly one of those, yeah. Because they're very old traditions, these stories, very, very old. And they're told in other, you could probably go to Lithuania and sit down and have some beer with some local, and they could tell you the same story that I just told about Daniel O'Connell in Lithuanian. Anybody speak Lithuanian?
You'd find some in the Garrity collection. So, mostly, I mean, stories of Fincool, but sometimes contemporary characters.
It's amazing.
From 1820s, 1830s.
Does anyone in my class have a question for Sean?
Nudge, nudge.
For extra credit.
Speak up.
No credit.
What?
Do it.
In a talk I heard, it was a priest who had been to Syria and actually spoke Aramaic. And what he described was rather fascinating, because he said there was something like 25 words in their vocabulary. There's one word in English, sand, because they could see the varieties of it, and they knew the varieties of it. Do you find the same thing in West Kerry Irish, that there's a refined vocabulary that in English we just
For rain.
I was just going to say, like, how many words we know for rain? One thing people often refer to is Eskimos having loads of words for snow. People often mention that. And I mean, there's Báisteach, Farhin. There are actually quite a lot of words, yeah. Amuriel. They have more words for sea. I think sea terminology is more prevalent than about rain, for example. There are lots of different words. There are things that an English speaker wouldn't think of ways to describe the ocean. You could say, I'm trying to think of a really good example of, Bohurna Leinchi, Leinchoch.
Mortis Fadiga.
Mortis Farige, for example. There's a word Leinchoch, which is just a word for when you're on a hill looking out on the sea, and it looks like a mirror, very flat. You could call that a Leinchoch, which is a word Sean McCrahen uses. Yeah. Yeah, something else I want to talk about as well there. I can't quite remember. Direction is very impressive. So, when you and it does come back to weather too, actually. So, one thing I loved in West Kerry, and I mean, no, not past tense, present tense. One thing I love in West Kerry is that people are very good at telling the weather and describing the weather, and most of the weather depends on the wind, since it's an island in the Atlantic. So you can tell what kind of weather you're going to have by knowing where the wind comes from. And they can feel where the wind is coming from. And they'll talk about it in terms of being northwest, southeast, and things like that. And that's very impressive. Just the direction of the wind. And it's so, they don't just think about it. They don't Google it. They don't do that. They can feel it, or they even see it as well. And then in terms of movement, so in English you say things like, I'm going down there, I'm coming over, I'm getting up. English, it's less specific. In Irish, you would say things like, traditional speakers of Irish would say things like, I'm going southwest down to the end of the field, or I'm coming back up northeast to see you tomorrow. So the guy you saw there from Thuras Broher, Pádraig O'Sullivan would speak like that. Sean Jim Fagel Mira Hurta would speak like that. Fantastic speakers of Irish. So I think that's a better way to answer the question. Yeah.
There was a student question
Yes.
percolating.
Molly, Takeshtiga?
Sorry. So I'm a gender studies minor. So like as soon as you started talking about like women's role in all of this, I just had like a question. So I know you said that his wife was just like listed like as his wife and her name like wasn't put in there.
Yeah.
Do you think that was more of like saying like women were insignificant at that time and it was like a patriarchal thing, or it was just kind of like just thrown in there because they were like, oh, and his wife is it, you know?
Well, I wouldn't say it was misogyny. I don't think it was that they were targeting women. I mean, it's a form of misogyny maybe to disregard women too. So they just weren't thinking about that. You know, the things in Ireland, before in Ireland, early in the Irish state, if you were a woman and you were a teacher, you'd have to resign if you got married. And there were things like that. You could, this might be safer to say in Villanova than in Notre Dame. But it might be a Catholic thing. It might be, you know, the Christian thing, Catholic thing, the place of the woman in the home. Neutral family, well, not the neutral family, the nuclear family, the nuclear family, and of course it's a very important period in Irish history right now in terms of speaking of women. Yeah.
Can I just say that when I was working in the folklore, the new folklore that we use for English to Irish, and in the older folklore, so in the O'Donnell, which is the old Irish to English dictionary, there was a lot of negative words about women. A lot more proportionally than there were describing men. So when we were working on the new folklore, we were really careful, and even one of the tasks I was given one of the days was a list of adjectives and to look at the examples we gave and to check the gender of the person about whom the example was and to make sure there was gender parity on them. Because that folklore was very misogynistic, and if you go through it, there's things like said about women in it and descriptions about women in sentences that are just flat out misogynistic. So that definitely was in the language, I think, and inherently so. I'd like to know how you'd respond in a public forum, if I can ask. What do you think about the role of Queen Maeve? So people sometimes say, "Oh, look, it's Maeve. She's a woman, and she's the star of the show in 8th century Ireland," or Eileen Rovni Chonel, or Maura Ní Gruma, who wrote "The Potatoes Are Black." Do you have an opinion about the role historically of Irish women? Are they privileged at all? Above men?
Yeah, or is that a false argument? Because it exists, but.
Oh, okay. I never thought that. And I'm also aware there's 2 cameras on me right now. I feel like I need to go away and read for like 2 weeks and make a scene. So I'm just going to say I never thought that till this point in my life.
Yeah.
I know, but one of the ways of looking at that issue is that all literature is written from a perspective, and the perspective for so long was male, even though it was unconscious. For those of us who are old enough, in this country, when I was growing up, they named hurricanes after women. The story was that when they started tracking hurricanes, the pilots would name them after their wives. Whether that was a compliment or not, I'm not sure. But it took a while for people to realize what was going on. So it was, and even, because I've got a degree poetry in the Bible, Scripture, it's written from a specific perspective, so you can tell who wrote it, but the net result of women not writing for so long is precisely this lopsided view that people then take as norm, which it never was.
It's very interesting. Yeah.
Maybe before we get into this discussion, if there's another student question, because this is a giant question, a topic.
Yeah.
But if there's another student question, and then maybe we could give you a break and we could talk informally.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Do any students have questions?
Sé fad níos fearr daoine eile chur caint ar an ábhar san.
Yeah, near this one. Anyone? So anything about any of the things that you learned? You're all writing down 3 things that you learned from this talk. Maybe you have questions about those things.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be super polemic.
Oh yeah, don't worry about sounding smart.
I prefer talking about language, and I tried to show that.
Okay, Maddie, you have a question?
So you were talking about that one word that means magpie.
Yeah.
So were there just words that existed that just don't exist anymore? Was that what you meant by that? Like,
What's interesting, there are a good few words. Snag vrac is a magpie, or bucra na manta. Magpies are common in Ireland, so they have words for them. That word there, marea futta, the reason that Sean McCridden hadn't heard it, the reason that I haven't been able to find any reference to it online or anything, is just because it was part of a spoken language that hadn't been documented in written speech. Maybe the dialect that originally used that word had died, and maybe Master Footcroft had just found the last native speaker in some town, some village in Cavan, and was told that was the Irish from magpie, and then the guy in Kerry hadn't heard it. Yeah, and words can escape manuscripts easily. Yeah, I think. Did you have another question?
Yeah, I was just curious too about the content of the stories of your guy, and I'm assuming that some of it was really ancient stuff that came down, and it must be interesting to sort of look at what happens to it like over the years, and I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
I mean, that comes back as well to just how historical figures were soaked up by existing pagan stories, I think, in a way. And another interesting point to do with that question you asked is the fact that Sean McCridden doesn't comment on anything that happened within the last 20 or 30 years. It's like you're getting a view on history that's 20 or 30 years late. And in a way, it seems that a lot of the opinions he's giving are those of his father, which is fantastic because we have no written evidence for his father's opinions or material. He's a mouthpiece for his father. And that's very interesting. It comes back to a time when everything was father, son, mother, daughter, passed down by word of mouth. And also this idea that you're speaking for a community was very much prevalent in Ireland in the 19th century. He would be reluctant to give his own opinion about something. And I could see there was a student who had a question.
what is a magpie?
Are they in America? They look like flying skunks. It's a bird. They're black and white, and they love shiny. They love tinfoil. Like they're infamous for going into gardens and taking people's rings, or if you're having a picnic. In a picnic you might have. Is tinfoil an American term? Aluminium. Yeah. Yeah. If you had your pizza and a bit of tinfoil, the magpie might come and steal your pizza.
Do you not have magpies here?
But they're like on the west coast.
Oh.
Okay.
So they came to the U.S. from Ireland, but the wrong way around.
Because there's a lot of superstition regarding magpies.
Of course.
Yeah, about if you see 2 on the road, you have to see a third.
1 for sorrow, 2 for joy. And if you don't see 2, if you only see 1, you have to salute it. All right, well maybe we'll wrap up the talk unless any more of my students have a question. No? We're okay? Okay, so just show our appreciation for Sean.
Thank you. Gurmina Mahagud.